Vikings, renowned for their belligerence and conquests, adhered to mourning rituals that modern people would find utterly repulsive. Imagine Ragnar Ironbeard, a formidable chieftain, around 950 AD in his home near Trondheim, Norway, commencing his day by meticulously rubbing fresh human urine into his teeth, using a piece of decaying walrus bone as a tool. This custom might seem disgusting to us, but for Vikings, it was a sacred ritual observed by men for over 3 centuries. The ammonia in urine was believed to strengthen teeth and protect against evil spirits causing decay. While ammonia does possess some cleaning properties, Vikings were deeply mistaken about the overall benefits of this practice. Surprisingly, this wasn't a forced measure dictated by hunger or desperation. On the contrary, it was a custom of Europe's most formidable warriors, people who held entire nations in fear. Despite their wealth, slaves, and the best weapons money could buy, Vikings, from poor farmers to wealthy jarls, began each morning by washing themselves in their own urine. This ritual was so vital that fathers taught it to their sons starting at age 7. Anyone who refused to participate was considered cursed by the gods and ostracized from society. How did this warlike culture convince itself that bathing in human waste was key to divine protection? The answer lies in their religious system, so brutal and bizarre that modern horror films seem like children's fairy tales. The Vikings' morning ritual was complex and precise. It began at 4 a.m. and involved a series of strict steps that had to be performed exactly, lest the gods punish the entire family. First, the eldest man in the household collected the urine of each family member in a large wooden bowl, adorned with runes dedicated to Odin. It was crucial that the bowl be made of oak struck by lightning, and the runes had to be carved by a man who had killed at least 5 enemies in battle. If anyone refused to provide their urine, or if the bowl cracked overnight, the ritual was considered defiled and had to be restarted with a 3-day fast. After the urine was collected, the men stripped completely and stood in a circle around the hearth in the center of the house. Women and children had to leave the room, as a woman's gaze was believed to steal masculine power from the ritual. Then, the eldest man drank the first bowl of urine, reciting a prayer to Thor that consisted of exactly 47 words. If he faltered, or if the urine cooled, the ritual failed and had to be repeated the next morning with a doubled fast. The prayer itself was quite grim. It asked Thor to accept a golden offering and use it to sharpen their weapons, weaken their enemies, and make their raids successful. But most disturbingly, at the end of the prayer, the men asked Thor to allow them to die in battle rather than in bed. This was because only warriors who died with weapons in hand could enter Valhalla. Thus, every morning, Vikings began with a plea for a violent death. After the eldest man finished drinking, every other man in the house had to drink from the same bowl in ascending order of age. The youngest boys, some as young as 7, were forced to drink last, when the urine was cold and contaminated by multiple mouths. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements indicates that child mortality rates rose sharply during winter months when the morning ritual was performed indoors and diseases spread rapidly through the shared bowl of urine. But drinking was not the end of the ritual. After each man drank his portion, they used the remaining urine to wash their hair, scrub their bodies, and clean their teeth. Vikings believed that human urine contained the essence of life force and that covering themselves with it would make them stronger in battle and more attractive to women. They had no concept of bacteria or hygiene, so they genuinely thought that the stronger the smell, the more potent the protection. Tooth cleaning was particularly repulsive. Vikings soaked pieces of animal bones in urine for several days until the bone became soft and spongy. They then used these contaminated bone fragments to scrub their teeth and gums until blood flowed freely from their mouths. They believed that blood mixed with urine created a magical paste that would prevent teeth from falling out during battle. In reality, This practice caused widespread infections that rotted their teeth from the inside and gave them such foul breath that Byzantine traders wrote detailed complaints about the smell in their official reports. The Vikings' morning routine was mandatory and repeated daily, not just on special occasions. Warriors performed this ritual throughout their adult lives, regardless of weather, illness, or circumstances. When embarking on raids, Vikings took containers of their own urine on their ships so as not to interrupt the ritual even during battles. English monks, observing Viking raids, described with horror warriors who emitted a stench resembling a hellish cesspit and whose breath, they claimed, could kill birds in flight. This ritual took its most extreme forms during the winter months, when Viking families were confined to their longhouses for weeks. During these periods, fermented fish oil and rancid fat were added to the morning urine, creating a mixture so repulsive it burned the skin on contact. This pain was intentional, as Vikings believed that the suffering endured during the morning ritual would prepare them for the pain of battle and prove their devotion to the gods. Archaeological excavations of Viking longhouses have uncovered ceramic pots specifically designed for collecting and storing urine. These pots, adorned with intricate patterns, were considered sacred objects and occupied the most honored place in the house, usually next to the weapon rack and the family's most valuable possessions. Some of these pots were large enough to hold over 75 liters of urine, indicating that wealthy Viking families collected and stored their waste for several weeks before using it in rituals. The smell inside a Viking longhouse in winter would have been unbearable by modern standards. Besides the daily urine rituals, the air would have been thick with the odor of fermented fish hanging from the rafters and animal fat used to waterproof clothing. This combination of smells would induce nausea in most modern people. However, Vikings considered this scent a divine incense, a sign that their home was blessed by the gods and protected from evil spirits. The morning ritual was just the beginning of a day filled with equally shocking practices. After washing in urine, the men proceeded to breakfast, consisting mainly of fermented fish paste mixed with rancid animal fat and pieces of moldy bread. The fish paste was prepared by burying whole fish in the ground for 6 months until it liquefied, which could then be drunk as soup. The fat was harvested from seals that had been dead for several weeks, and the bread was intentionally allowed to develop a thick layer of mold, as Vikings believed that consuming fungi would induce visions of future battles. Women had their own morning rituals, no less repulsive. While men washed in urine, Viking women collected menstrual blood in special wooden bowls and used it to draw runes on their foreheads and cheeks. They believed menstrual blood possessed powerful magic, capable of protecting their families from illness and bringing good fortune to their husbands' raids. The blood remained on their faces all day, mixing with sweat and dirt, forming a crust that cracked and peeled off in pieces. Children who were too young to participate in adult rituals had their own gruesome morning routine. Viking parents fed their infants a mixture of pre-chewed food and human saliva, which had fermented in clay pots for several days. The saliva was collected from the entire family, including sick relatives and elderly grandparents whose mouths were full of infected teeth and bleeding gums. This practice was believed to transfer the family's strength and courage to the next generation. In reality, it spread diseases that killed about half of all Viking children before they reached the age of 5. The most horrifying aspect of these morning rituals was not their repulsive nature, but how deeply they were intertwined with Viking religious beliefs. Norse gods were not benevolent or merciful deities seeking the happiness and well-being of their followers. They were cruel, unpredictable beings who demanded constant proof of devotion through suffering and sacrifice. The morning ritual was designed to be as unpleasant as possible, as Vikings believed their gods would only respect those willing to endure pain and humiliation for their faith. This religious philosophy permeated all aspects of Viking life. They intentionally consumed spoiled food, drank contaminated water, and lived in unsanitary conditions, believing that comfort and cleanliness were signs of weakness that would incur the wrath of the gods. When Viking warriors died in battle, their families celebrated the event by drinking even more urine and consuming even more rotten food, believing that their suffering would help the deceased warrior's soul reach Valhalla faster. The mourning ritual also served a practical purpose in Viking society. It represented a daily test of loyalty and devotion, helping to identify potential traitors or cowards. Any man who showed disgust or unwillingness during the ritual was deemed unreliable and excluded from participating in important raids. Viking leaders used the ritual as a way to maintain discipline and ensure that only the most dedicated warriors were given weapons and responsibility. The Viking mourning ritual of consuming their own urine was not merely a bizarre tradition, but a deeply ingrained practice infused with religious beliefs and a sense of duty. This custom, passed down through generations, symbolized a connection to ancestors and a pursuit of spiritual purity. Refusal to perform the ritual was considered sacrilege, capable of bringing the gods' wrath upon the entire family. Despite the adoption of Christianity in the 10th and 11th centuries, many Vikings secretly continued the mourning ritual. Some, attempting to reconcile old traditions with the new faith, replaced urine with holy water while retaining the other repulsive elements of the rite. However, with the passage of time and the modernization of society, the mourning ritual gradually faded. By the 12th century, most Scandinavian communities abandoned this practice in favor of Christian prayer and cleaner hygiene. Nevertheless, echoes of the old ritual persisted in folk traditions and superstitions until the 16th century, when some Norwegian farmers still consumed small amounts of urine on special occasions, considering it an ancient remedy for illnesses and bad luck. Archaeological studies confirm the existence of these mourning rituals. Soil analysis at Viking settlement sites revealed elevated concentrations of urea and ammonia, as well as fragments of ceramic pottery used for storing and processing human waste. Furthermore, DNA analysis of Viking teeth showed significant damage caused by urine-based oral hygiene, with much higher rates of infection than in other medieval populations. The Viking mourning rituals demonstrate how deeply religious beliefs can influence human behavior, compelling people to perform actions contrary to common sense and self-preservation instincts. Vikings, known for their outstanding achievements in shipbuilding, jurisprudence, art, and poetry, were nonetheless willing to neglect personal hygiene and health for the sake of religious convictions. Moreover, this practice illustrates how social pressure can normalize even the most extreme forms of behavior. In Viking society, refusing to consume urine was not just a matter of personal hygiene, but an act of religious rebellion that could lead to severe consequences such as ostracism, violence, or even death. The ritual was so ingrained in the culture that challenging it seemed unthinkable to most people. The history of Viking mourning rituals helps us understand how societies can develop and maintain beliefs that seem absurd to outsiders. Vikings had their own logical justifications for these practices, based on their religious beliefs, medical knowledge, and social structure. And while these justifications were flawed, Vikings genuinely believed in them and faithfully followed them. Thus, the history of Viking mourning rituals serves as a reminder that human behavior is shaped not only by objective reality, but also by cultural beliefs. The ingenuity and determination that made Vikings successful warriors and explorers also compelled them to start each day by consuming their own urine and covering themselves in waste. Their mourning ritual was not a sign of ignorance or barbarism, but a logical consequence of a worldview that prioritized religious devotion and warrior culture over personal comfort and hygiene. However, the mourning urine ritual was just one element of a system of repulsive daily practices that defined Viking life. After completing their morning consumption of waste, Viking men spent the next hour on what they called blood preparation for the day ahead. This process involved making small cuts on their arms and legs with rusty iron knives, then rubbing salt and fermented fish oil into the wounds to keep them infected and painful. Vikings believed that constant physical pain would make them immune to the shock of battle wounds, and proved to their gods that they were serious about their desire to die as warriors. The wounds were not allowed to heal. Every morning, Viking men reopened yesterday's cuts and created new ones, building up layers of scar tissue that covered their bodies like armor of infected flesh. Archaeological studies of Viking skeletons have revealed hundreds of deliberate cuts on the bones of arms and legs, with clear signs that these wounds were repeatedly reopened over many years or decades. The infection rate was so high that many Viking warriors died of blood poisoning long before participating in battles. Women also participated in their version of blood preparation, using broken pottery shards to scrape layers of skin from their legs and arms until they bled. The blood was collected in small clay bowls and mixed with honey and crushed insects to create a paste that was rubbed into their hair and scalp. This mixture was believed to make their hair thick and strong, but in reality, it caused widespread scalp infections, leading to partial hair loss in many Viking women by the age of 30. The terrifying customs of the Vikings, preparation for war, starting from childhood. Blood preparation rituals were perhaps the most frightening part of Viking life, especially for children. Boys reaching the age of 8 were subjected to daily cuts, but they were forbidden from using knives like adult warriors. Instead, they had to scratch the skin of their legs with their fingernails, trying not to inflict serious wounds but to cause enough pain to draw blood. Boys who showed weakness and cried during these procedures were believed to grow up cowardly and disgrace their lineage in battle. Girls had it even harder. From the age of 10, they were monthly subjected to skin cauterization with red-hot metal rods. The burns were inflicted on areas of the body hidden by clothing to keep this practice secret from outsiders. The scars served as a symbol of honor, proving that a girl was strong enough to become a warrior's wife and the mother of healthy children. Refusal to participate or screaming during the cauterization led to expulsion from the family and the inability to marry. The cauterization ritual was performed in the darkest corner of the longhouse, in the presence of only women. Metal rods were heated red-hot in the hearth and then pressed against the girl's skin for 10 agonizing seconds while she bit on a piece of leather to stifle her screams. The smell of burning flesh permeated the air for a long time, mixing with the other repulsive odors of the dwelling, creating an atmosphere unbearable for those unaccustomed to the harsh Viking life. After the morning blood preparation, Viking families gathered for a meal consisting of foods so spoiled that by modern standards they would be considered hazardous waste. The main dish was a soup made from fish that had been buried in the ground for 6 months. During this time, the fish completely decomposed, turning into a foul-smelling liquid, the mere scent of which could cause unconsciousness. Vikings believed that heat activated the magical properties of rotten fish, giving them strength for the entire day. The soup was served in bowls that were never washed, only scraped with dirty knives before reuse. The accumulated layers of fat and food residue created an ideal environment for bacteria capable of killing most people in a few days. However, Vikings, through constant exposure to contaminated food and water, developed incredible resistance to diseases and could consume toxins lethal to others. Along with the fish soup, Vikings ate bread specially prepared from moldy grain and dirty water. The bread was covered with a thick layer of green and black mold, making it soft and spongy, with a sweet fermentation taste and a bitter decay flavor. It was believed that eating moldy food granted visions of the future and helped predict the outcome of battles and raids. The morning diet also included pieces of raw meat that had hung from the longhouse rafters for weeks without any preservation other than salt. The meat teemed with maggots, which Vikings ate along with the flesh, believing they contained concentrated life force that made them stronger and more fertile. Maggots were considered a delicacy, and Viking children often fought over who would eat the fattest ones. After breakfast, Viking men spent an hour sharpening their weapons and offering prayers to their gods, asking them to help kill as many enemies as possible. The prayers were specific and brutal, detailing how they intended to cut off the heads, arms, and genitals of their enemies. Violence was not a metaphor, but a genuine desire to inflict as much pain and suffering as possible on anyone who opposed them. Vikings believed that their gods rewarded cruelty and savagery above all else. The weapon sharpening ritual involved cutting fingers on the blade to test its sharpness, then rubbing the blood into the metal while chanting the names of all those they planned to kill. It was believed that blood created a magical bond between the warrior and his weapon, making his strikes more precise and deadly. Archaeological analysis of Viking weapons shows clear traces of human blood on the edges of blades, confirming that this practice was widespread and regularly performed. Viking women had their own, equally disturbing, weapon-related rituals. From childhood, they were trained to wield knives and axes, and were expected to kill any enemy who invaded their homes while the men were away on raids. Each morning, they practiced striking and slashing techniques on wooden dummies carved to resemble human bodies. The dummies were smeared with pig's blood to make the practice more realistic, and the women had to hit specific targets designed to inflict maximum pain and a slow death on real enemies. The most skilled Viking women could kill a person in over 20 different ways, each engineered to prolong agony before death. These Scandinavian barbarians, renowned for their bloodthirsty raids, performed horrifying rituals in the face of impending doom. They possessed a sinister knowledge of anatomy, allowing them to surgically sever tendons while avoiding vital arteries, strike internal organs without causing immediate death, and dismember bodies while victims remained conscious. These sadistic skills were passed down through the female line, from mother to daughter, through practical sessions where elder women instructed younger ones, subjecting captured slaves to monstrous torture. The morning rituals culminated during the winter solstice, when Viking families, confined to their longhouses, endured incessant darkness and the hardships of communal living. During this time, daily practices became even more extreme and brutal as people desperately sought to prove their devotion to the gods and solidify their position within the family hierarchy. Winter mourning rituals included consuming large quantities of urine mixed with blood from daily ritualistic cuts, eating spoiled food to demonstrate their resilience, and grueling prayer sessions that lasted for hours. Prayers grew increasingly feverish and desperate as people implored their gods to end winter and allow them to resume their raiding and killing. The psychological strain of these prolonged rituals drove many Vikings to madness, and longhouses echoed with screams and violence as family members turned against each other in religious ecstasy. The most extreme winter ritual was the so-called divine trial, where Viking men deliberately inflicted increasingly severe self-mutilations to prove their faith and courage. They broke their fingers, cauterized their skin with hot coals, and even cut off parts of their ears and noses as sacrifices to Odin and Thor. The resulting injuries were irreversible and disfiguring, but Vikings wore them as badges of honor, affirming their right to a place in Valhalla after death. Archaeological findings from Viking settlements reveal an extremely high winter mortality rate, with entire families perishing during particularly harsh seasons. The combination of contaminated food, infected wounds, unsanitary living conditions, and deliberate self-mutilation created a deadly cocktail of disease and death, claiming hundreds of lives annually. However, the Vikings interpreted these deaths as a sign that their gods were selecting the most devoted warriors for immediate ascension to the afterlife. Spring rituals, marking the end of winter, were the most brutal and terrifying of all. When the weather finally became warm enough for Vikings to leave their longhouses, they celebrated by performing human sacrifices that involved the most elaborate tortures they could devise. The victims were typically slaves or captives, specifically kept alive through winter for this purpose. Their deaths lasted for several days, during which Vikings took turns inflicting various forms of pain and mutilation. For over 3 centuries, the most formidable warriors of medieval Europe began each day by consuming human waste and pleading with their gods for a violent death in battle. They did this not out of coercion, but because they genuinely believed it was right. The Viking morning ritual stands as one of history's most striking examples of how religious belief can compel rational individuals to willingly engage in practices that appear utterly insane to anyone outside their culture.